Hi guys. Now, when I worked as a commercial photographer in the UK, it really wasn't a problem because I was doing studio work mostly. About 85% of my work was based in the studio, so we used artificial lighting, always set the ISO to 100. We set the aperture to either throw the background out of focus or keep it in focus, but that was a creative decision, more about that later. And the shutter speed, given that it was in the studio and based on a tripod, could be anything you wanted. We weren't shooting moving objects, we were shooting largely products. So doing landscape photography is a completely different challenge. The landscape doesn't stay still. The light doesn't stay still. Clouds come across the sun and act as filters, reducing the amount of light on the scene, throwing shadows across the scene. If there's a wind, things in the scene move. Grass might blow around, objects can shoot across your camera. I was up in the Sierra Nevada the other day and we unexpectedly came across a herd of wild horses, so that was a great photo opportunity, but you have to be alert to the possibilities. So in terms of ISO, aperture and shutter speed, let's talk about the interdependence of the three things. So all of these things control the amount of light coming into the image. And the reason I hesitate there is because ISO is subtly different. So aperture literally controls the amount of sunshine or the amount of reflected light coming into the camera. You make the aperture smaller or larger, and that directly affects the quantity of light, and this is measured in f-stops. Shutter speed, by virtue of the fact that it controls the amount of time the shutter is open, literally controls the amount of light striking the sensor. So it comes through the lens, through the aperture, and it's striking the sensor. Now, if that's a lot of light, or you go for a faster shutter speed to minimize the amount of light coming through, or minimize the amount of time that light is allowed to strike the sensor, or you can leave the shutter open for a longer amount of time. And in extreme cases, you'll be familiar with this, we've all seen the sort of milky water and flattened out seas, which are achieved by having shutter speeds of a minute and longer, usually using filters to achieve that. So the three things are related. The reason I hesitated about ISO is because ISO doesn't allow you to affect the amount of light coming in. The amount of light coming in is a constant which you can reduce by shutting it off or by reducing the size of the aperture that it comes through. What ISO does is it boosts the amount of light that has already struck the sensor. So in other words, it's an amplifier. So ISO amplifies the lightness, if you like, the amount of light that has been registered by the sensor. And that's great, but in so doing, there is a risk that it will introduce noise into the photograph. So this is what we need to bear in mind. So traditionally, we've always gone for the lowest possible ISO and made the adjustments around that. But in landscape photography, that's not always possible. So the beauties of living in rural Spain. There's a slice of village life there for you right there. Okay, what was I talking about? I was talking about, or getting towards, the element of introducing creative decisions into the balancing of ISO, aperture and shutter speed. Now, the first thing to realize is that because these three things all contribute to the amount of light in your picture, or all contribute to the brightness of your picture, it therefore follows that interdependency can actually be measured. So we measure this in f-stops. So what we're saying is, if you've got a set exposure and you want to introduce more blur into it, your option to do that is to alter the shutter speed, and you're going to leave that shutter open for a little bit longer, so that movement gets captured in the image in the form of a slight amount of blurring. Now, the effect of that will also make the picture brighter, so what you need to do is to close down the aperture by the same amount that you decrease the shutter speed. Okay, so let's have a quick talk about the creative decisions. There are creative decisions attached to aperture and attached to shutter speed. So we've just mentioned shutter speed is used for introducing an amount of, let's say, artistic blur. So if I, for example, take a picture of a racing car and do that on a hugely fast shutter speed, I'm going to freeze the movement, and it's not going to look as though it's ripping through the track. And what I want to do with a car is certainly to have some element of move. So the wheels rotating for sure. I'm going to track that car, so I need the background to be completely blurred. And that will give the impression of a fast-moving object. Same with racehorses. You've got that horse galloping through the field. You want to see a little amount of motion on the legs, not enough to make them invisible, but enough to show you definition of a leg, but you know that it's moving. And unfortunately, there are no tables to look up that give you, racing horse, aesthetic blur measurements. This is done by trial and error. And probably a starting point for that is to bear in mind that you'll get a sharp photograph at the reciprocal of the focal length. So if I'm using a 50mm lens, all things being equal, I should get a sharp photograph at 1/50, 1/50th of a second. And this is very much a rule of thumb. People argue they've got extra steady hands and they can hold the camera steady and so on and so forth. These are just rules of thumb. So if 1/50 in that circumstance gives me a clear, sharp photograph, if I go to 1/25, 1/10, 1 second, you will get an increasing amount of blur in that picture. So that's the story with shutter speed. With aperture, we're talking about depth of field. Now, if you're a landscape photographer and you're shooting enormous vistas, that is not entirely an academic question, but it becomes less irksome, because if you're focusing on a point that's half a mile away, the loss of 50 yards at the front of the frame or 25 yards at the front of frame because you've adjusted the aperture is not really going to hurt you. But if you're doing still life and you're shooting objects that are a meter from the camera, then aperture is going to make a really big difference. If you're a travel photographer, you're shooting maybe place settings at a restaurant table, you want to throw the background out of focus, and the way to do that is to open up that aperture nice and wide. In so doing, you're letting more light into the picture, and you've got to compensate for that by increasing the shutter speed. Balance the thing out. Now, fortunately, the display inside the camera, your exposure meter, allows you to make these changes pretty much intuitively. You can get your balanced exposure. Experience will show you that whether you want to expose slightly to the left or slightly to the right. I fundamentally push my exposure to the point where I'm about to start clipping the whites, and the reason I do this is because I don't want to have to amplify my blacks too much. That's another good way of introducing noise into a picture. So I try to not expose for the blacks, because that would mean I will be almost certainly clipping the highlights, and you cannot get detail back out of clipped highlights. Much easier to retrieve detail from blackened blacks or crushed blacks. Okay, so the fundamental point that this entire video is about getting the balance right and making the creative decisions and what you prioritize in order to do that. And typically my process is this. In the field, I will look at the picture that I'm about to take, and I will make a very quick decision of what's important in this picture. Has it got to be pin sharp? Do I want some blur in the picture? Am I trying to show motion? Do I want a deep depth of field? Do I want a shallow depth of field? And it's that decision that I base my aperture and my shutter speed settings on. And I will then go to ISO if I need more light, fundamentally. So typically, if I'm shooting in the evening, I'm probably almost certainly going to have to introduce more light into that picture. And so I'll set my shutter speed, my aperture appropriately, and I'll dial up the ISO until that picture matches the lighting conditions that I'm seeing with my naked eye. Okay, so that was the point of the video. Hopefully trying to make this as simple as possible and give you some rules of thumb that you can take off into the field and will work for you every single time. The last thing that I'm going to say is there's one real howler of a mistake that I am embarrassed to admit that I made very recently, which is I left my evening settings on with the ISO boosted up to 2400 or so, and I went out in a morning shoot, bright sunshine, and the first 6 frames that I took before I actually looked at them were unviewable because they were basically whited out. So I always get into the habit, I try to get into the habit of putting my camera back to its normal settings, i.e. ISO 100. I'll probably put the aperture somewhere in the middle, and the shutter speeds to what I know will give me a sharp exposure, 1/100 or so. You can save these settings also as a preset, so just in case you get caught on the hoof out in the field, you can quickly dial in your preset, and I'll take you through exactly how you do that process with Canon cameras in a subsequent video. I think this is enough about camera settings for now. Hopefully we'll have a more interesting and vibrant subject for you next week. Okay, give us a like, give us a subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much, guys.